And I say this, this subcontinent has some of the most bravest and courageous people, but no nation should demand such courage from its people. No nation. But how much we demand of our people. The sheer courage it takes to just get up every morning and live and advocate for your people. We should be so proud of them. So proud of them. But yet it's unfair that we demand so much from them, right?
Lights, Camera, Azadi is a show that is on a quest to meet personalities. The personalities who have always challenged the status quo. These people are courageous and confident to speak the truth and are best at it. Though the world may or may not agree with them, they always work for nation building. We want to talk to them and understand their perspective. We want to know their worldview, their thoughts, and what gaps do they see in the society, and most importantly, how to live life fearlessly. My name is Vandit Jain, and I'm just a medium to get these stories to you. Welcome everyone to another week and another episode of Lights Camera Azadi. Hope you all are safe and sound. Today, we have a very special guest with us. Suchitra is the founder and executive director of the Police Project, a hybrid research and journalism organization. She is the author of the book Midnight's Border, which is a brilliant work of investigative journalism, where she travels for 7 years and 9,000 miles to get these stories out. This is the first time I had an episode on a book launch. It was indeed a wonderful experience. Suchitra operates from a position of strong empathy, compassion, clarity, and intellect. It was an experience to record with her. The episode becomes very intense towards the end, but it is only in these moments where I feel my work is truly worth it. Thank you once again for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hi all. Lights Camera Azadi is a year old now. While I do this effort part-time and after office hours and on weekends, the truth is, I haven't made any money out of it. If you think what I do is worth it, it adds value in your existing knowledge base, and you want me to continue doing this, I request you to please support me for an episode that you like. You can go to patreon.com/azadi and make any contribution, big or small, of your choice. To just make a one-time contribution, cancel the charges after you have paid. Your small contribution can go a long way in my endeavor to bring stories to you. This episode is brought to you by Miva Naturals. Miva is a homemade brand dedicated to your personal care experience. Miva make products with dedication, love, and with a touch of nature. They don't use any chemicals or harmful substances in their products to ensure you get the best feeling, which is long lasting. Miva makes products which are colorful and are fun to use, and it aims to be your best experience in the whole day. If you'd like to order your first Miva product, please go to miva.co.in and insert the code Azadi during checkout and get instant 20% off. So, what are you waiting for? So, 3, 2, 1. Suchitra Vijayan, welcome to Lights Camera Azadi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Just finished and concluded the amazing book that you have written, Suchitra, and I would like to compliment you for the work that you have put in all these years. And I no words and no sentences can sort of justify the amazing hard work and the risk you have taken to get these stories out. And congratulations once again.
Thank you. I'm still a little in shock. I can't believe I finally wrote this book and that it's out in the world. Sometimes I have to get up. I mean, I did this last night. I got up last night. I just got up and I went to the living room where I have all my author copies and I touched it and just to make sure I'm not dreaming. So it still feels, I'm grateful and overwhelmed and humbled that this book is out. So thank you for engaging with it.
No way, Sachitra. And would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and how did this idea of getting this book, going to borders and getting stories, got into your head and everything, like where you come from till this book?
Okay, sure. I was born and raised in Madras, and after high school, I left for England to study. I went to study law. I was trained as a barrister, and then soon after, I worked for the War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and then I went and lived in Cairo for about 2 years, where I started working initially with an organization that helped refugees with resettlement, and later founded an organization co-founded an organization called the Resettlement Legal Aid Project that was built to give legal aid for Iraqi refugees. This was in the aftermath of 9/11, and you saw an exodus of Iraqis leaving their home and then trying to find asylum in various countries like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. And our aim was to kind of get them resettled. I think when I finished doing that, I moved. Like all crazy women, I moved to the United States because I fell in love with a boy. And then I went to grad school at Yale, where I wanted to study Afghanistan because 9/11 was an important moment, or the breaking point moment for a lot of us. I was a very young person. I had just left high school. I was going into adulthood in this moment of dystopia. And over the years, I saw what this did to so many of my friends, especially my Muslim friends and brown and black friends who lived on this basis, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I've always wanted to go to Afghanistan. And at Yale, one of the things that I wanted to do was that I wanted to kind of go back and study and understand this war, but from the perspective of the people most affected by it. And going to Afghanistan then led me to go spend time in the Afghanistan Pakistan border. Initially, I was trying to think about, I was studying insurgency movements there, but then once I got to the Paktika province and started traveling along the border, I realized that so many of the concerns that I was living with and thinking through kind of came together. Whether it was my work as a lawyer, whether it was the work I was doing in Cairo, whether it was the issues that occupied me when I was trying to understand what was happening in Afghanistan, all of this were about questions of freedom and citizenship and movement, all tied to the idea of territorial sovereignty. And when I came back from Afghanistan, and by this time, mind you, I had been away from home for almost 10 years. And I really didn't know, and also India over the last 10 years between 2001 and 2012 had transformed in ways that I wasn't sure about. And this started initially as a photography project. I really wanted to travel, and then my initial question was, now that I've looked at Afghanistan in this way, could I perhaps do something very similar, um, to think about India through her fringes? And of course, that's how the initial kernel of an idea started. And of course, it evolved, it changed. And of course, you can't write about India in a few weeks. You can't write about India even if you lived a lifetime. I still don't think I understand this country, or at least that I can speak about this country that has so many multitudes. And that's how the project started. And I started traveling. And of course, a project like this also takes immense resources. And I didn't have those resources, which also kind of delayed, which means that I had to travel, I had to come back, raise money, go back. So yeah, that's how the book began, and it changed, it transformed in many ways over the last 8 years, and now we have the book.
Yeah, and the reason I was so excited to read it, and because a part of me also wanted and thought about such doing these endeavors like you did, and it was something like that you are taking me with you in all these chronicles. And yeah, though I never thought that I'll go to borders, but I often thought that to understand this country more better, we need to go to the most remotest of destinations which are beyond our imaginations to understand this country, uh, its hierarchies, its society on a much more deeper level. And kudos to you, you did this. This is a fantastic job. Tell me this. I think you have visited a lot. You have traveled the world as well, from what I understand. Uh, Tell me, how has been your experience carrying the Indian passport?
Oh, painful, painful. Painful in the sense that, again, I don't, when I say painful, I also want to, I say this in the book as well, is that I still have a passport, right? I have the immense privilege of having a passport that most Indians don't. Chances are most Indians might be deprived of it if the way things go. So let me start by saying that the very function of having a passport that even allows me travel, the resources to travel, is immense privilege. But beyond the privilege comes also this idea of us to think about border regimes and passports. What do passports do, right? This is not some kind of an innocent project. The passport project, the border project, are all projects of classifying humans into hierarchies. Why is it that someone gets to travel more easily without a moment of thought, as some of us have to say pay huge tax? I call it a tax, a visa fees, a tax, while others can't even with the tax cannot travel. Why is it that some of the children who cross the border fearing their lives are now end up in ICE detention centers? Why is it that we are having these conversations? Why is it that we are talking about legal and illegal? Um, so while it's been painful, I also don't want this to be about saying, "Oh my God, it's so painful." I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was this photo shoot in which Priyanka Chopra had a T-shirt. She said, "Traveler, nomad, wanderlust," and I think that, and then of course it got a lot of backlash. And I think, why is it that when certain groups of people travel, they become travelers and wanderers and nomads and expats, while some of us becomes immigrants and migrants and refugees? And I think that is something that we have to keep in the back of our mind. And for me, I was always the only, for example, even when I was in Cairo, there were other Indians of British origin, American origin, but I was the only Indian in most of these spaces. Um, and the Indian passport, and I remember in when I was in Egypt, I my passport was stolen, and it was very it was stolen just before I was about to. Me and my friend Simon Olson were supposed to travel to South Sudan. We were supposed to take the ship, the boat into Sudan, and then travel down all the way along the Nile that flows. And then just the day of the travel, my passport was stolen. And even my experience of being at the Indian embassy was so excruciating that the deputy counsel who was then at the Indian embassy in Cairo told me that, you know, women wear these tight jeans and they put their passports in their back pockets and then they loose it and they come to us all the time, because by this time there were a lot of Indian tourists who were coming to Egypt first. And the way this man spoke to me was so disrespectful. He looked down upon me as if I was this stupid girl who had lost her passport, when indeed mine was stolen in very violent way. Uh, and that kind of says it's not just our relationship to other places when we travel, it's also how our own state treats us. And again, let me remind you that I'm still someone who is born to a Hindu father, upper caste Hindu father. I'm still an English speaking elite. I still come from the privilege of caste and class. Despite all of this, that even that sense of caste and class privilege can only protect you so much. And I remember, and then there was one moment when I was asked for sexual favors to get my visas renewed at the Egyptian Mogama, and I again reported it to the embassy. And this man says, "Oh, no, no, no! Egyptians have such great respect for us. I can't believe somebody would even talk to you like this." Even this very quiet dismissal of which um, people would treat you. Or I mean, I can go on and on about that. And I remember wanting to go to traveling. I wanted to cross into Gaza from the Rafah border. And again, I needed a letter from the Indian embassy, and they were like, "Why are you doing this? Why? I mean, what is your function?" And the patriarchal nature of which the state still, the paternalistic and patriotic nature, the patriarchal nature in which not only the Indian state treats its own citizens, but also how all nation states treat. So end of it, yeah, it's a very painful process of just carrying and traveling, especially when you're carrying and traveling while a brown woman with an Indian passport.
And what made you go to the deepest ends of Indian border? Was it the love for India, or was it something? Was it more like an exploration? And what was that inner emotion that you took so much of courage, risk, and you traveled from Pakistan border to Bangladesh border to till Tawang? I mean, you covered almost major known border areas.
I don't know, I don't know how this love for India is, or is it? I don't even know if the India in my nostalgia exists anymore. Let me say it this way: I don't know if I love India, but I truly have immense love for the people of the subcontinent. Let me put it that way. I have immense love for my people. And when I say my people, I say people who fought for freedom, people who've made my freedom possible. If I may, I want to kind of explain. My grandfather was a communist. He was a freedom fighter. He was one of the first people to be arrested in 1949. One of the first cases of sedition. He was one of the first political prisoners of India. I didn't know many of this because he also didn't speak to me about it. But I think I was about 14, and we had to do a project for the school. And this was, and then as a part of that project, something, I'd written something, and then I wanted to use that material to for a debate in the school. And I was telling my grandfather how one of the arguments I was making is that, oh, India would have been better off if we were still under the British rule. Look at how the country is being ruled. And very quickly, my grandfather, again, as he said something that has stayed with me for so long. He said that, you have no idea how lucky you are to be a citizen of an independent nation, because he wasn't. He was a colonial subject. He had to fight for it. He had to go underground for it. He had to lose so much. For example, my father never knew my grandfather growing up because my grandfather was never there. He was a political prisoner underground, running away from, violence that could have killed him, fighting, protesting. So my father never. So in that sense, you lose so much when you are a child of someone who's fighting for other people's rights. And I think that stayed with me, you know, the immense privilege of being a citizen. So my love comes for my people, and my people are those who fought valiantly for this freedom, who still continue to fight for that freedom. And that love can transcend boundaries and borders, especially borders that the departing colonial forces left behind. I have immense love for those women on the street fighting in Pakistan. I have immense love for the students in Bangladesh who continue to fight. I have immense love for the Tamil community that still continues to fight for Elam. The idea of a homeland for them has been denied. So one can love this aspiration that people continue to fight for, the common dignity of the man, the common dignity for us to love, to live happily. That is the love that I have. Some of those people might not lie within the boundaries of this nation state, and they don't have to. Um, I don't know how much of this country is going to survive the onslaught, but I will always continue to love and have immense love for the people of the subcontinent. That's why I say not India. Professor Manan Ahmad has this wonderful new book called The Loss of Hindustan, and it's a wonderful book because it talks about how Hindustan was lost to the vast communities because we communalized our freedoms, because we somehow felt that our freedom was could only be in a certain way. So that's why I think the notion of love is, I think, is what it is, and I think love is also radical. It's political. I don't know if I've answered your question, but perhaps that's the reason.
No, indeed, you did, and I think there in reference to what your I think grandfather said. I think there's this wonderful quote that you have written on page 4 is quote, "But when maps become the arsenal of imperialism and colonial conquest, people in turn become surveys and statistics." Stop quote.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
yeah, that I think that sums up pretty much the sentiment that probably your grandfather went through. And and then moving forward, I think you have written this very wonderful line, goes on page 8, which quote, "It would have been easier to pick 10 places on the border, parachute in, describe them and leave. That would have been the most efficient but not the most truthful. From the farthest outpost of India to her ungoverned spaces and forgotten regions, I travel to places shaped by an array of competing histories." Wow. So I think that also sums up, I think, pretty much from what I understand as a reader, that your sentiment while you were traveling. I think you wanted to capture stories, you wanted to capture narratives which are probably hidden from mainstream ideas. They are probably gone, and they are ambushed in the dust of histories. And I'm so glad to try to get these stories out. So let's start, Suchitra. Let's start from the first chapter that you have mentioned, which is and I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Is Sar Hawaza? Is that correct?
Sarhauza.
Saraza. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so a small place at an Afghanistan Pakistan border, and you spend you quite time there, and this region is sort of suffering from its own history, with Soviet invasion, with invasion, its own war. Uh, Tell me about your experience there, and tell me about the stories you encountered and what was it like there. Uh, the ones you have mentioned in the book as well.
I think one thing that Afghanistan is it's been orientalized to death, right? So you have so many, and I think sometimes I'm also guilty of it. Maybe I was guilty of it early on because it's so easy to not easy. It's easy to kind of follow the same narrative cues that the people have used to describe the space before you. So for me, I was there to understand something. I was there to understand what this war on terror meant to the people who were suffering. And again, as I said, this book maybe just captures a fraction of the things I've seen. It's also like it's very hard. There's a very my friend Rajshekar, who also has a book called "Despite the States," said this to me, and I think he was very right. He said there's a very tightly curated travel history, and it's right. It's very tightly curated because there's so many stories and encounters that didn't make it, and if I put everything in it, it would be a rambling mess. Um, so the thing about Afghanistan is that it's a space that has been exploited, plundered in so many ways, not only by the invading forces, but also those who claim to come here to do good. Far more has been done in the name of, liberating the space, doing good, than actually doing any good. And for me, it was more importantly seeing up close what the American imperial missionary can do to the people and how violence on black and brown bodies are continuously justified. The Syria was just bombed. There was a massive attack on Syria by the Biden administration yesterday. And we have to really understand the immense damage that we've done. When I say we very specifically. It's not that India doesn't have complicity, that global complicity of creating, taking a space and completely destroying its people and spaces. Second thing, as I said, is that it's just such a stunningly beautiful country made of such generous people. Again, this sentiment can also become very orientalizing, right? You're kind of making them into these noble, stunning savages who, I think they are more about anything else, are people who are trying to struggle for the same things: dignity, freedom, and capacity to decide for themselves what their future should be. And they've been denied of that. And I think one of the things that is very powerful is when Commander Mahmoud says, he says, and this appears early on in the book. Actually, the book opens with this landscape of Paktika province. If you look at it, you don't know where the line starts and ends. And he says, it's the colonizer's map. They had no respect for her land. Why should we respect their borders? I think that sentiment also translates to how people's rights are defined, how people's sentiments are defined. Their histories are already written for them even before they can take part in it. But more importantly, I think it shows the deep complicity. I think at this point in time, I could be wrong, but we need to check. The last time I checked, I think $13 trillion had gone into Afghanistan. And the war on terror still is morphed in many ways, but continues to affect how we see the world. And I would say there were two breakpoints for me. I think the three maybe breaking points for me. One was because I lived in Cairo, and for 2 years I just heard people. I prepared testimonies of Iraqis fleeing their home. We helped close to 900 families, which means that I at least remember 100 family stories. And these family stories are also stories of how the nation of Iraq, the state of Iraq, was destroyed, and its people continue to suffer from it. The next point was then physically being in Afghanistan and seeing what the occupation had done. The military industrial complex, just as we were talking about freedom, they would have raves in Afghanistan, where all these white and brown aid workers would party. At one point in time, there used to be a restaurant that only allowed um, foreigners who could come in and drink while Afghans were not allowed in. Like, imagine, right? And as I write in the book, people just had no sense of the damage that they were doing. And I think it was a beginning point for me to kind of understand the sheer amount of violence we've left unleashed on this world, and that will continue to affect generations to come. We have left enough trauma to be inherited for generations to come.
And this part when you mention about this young boy, Jan Mohammed, who who gets a week of training, he gets guns, $100, and M&M candies to fight the Taliban, and
Hmm.
he's a teenager, and what I was thoroughly surprised and shocked with this idea that how a foreign force is using young boys to fight their own wars, you know.
Right. The young boy was not called Jan Muhammad. Jan Muhammad was another person. But yeah, absolutely. I think we forget. Again, this he was a young boy because he didn't know what his age, but he's definitely not old enough to be recruited. If you look at his face, I mean, does he look? I mean, there's a photograph of him. That's the reason why there are two
Yeah.
photographs of him. There's one photograph of him early on when he's standing there with his. If you look at it, he's wearing the vest that's the thing that you use to put the cartridges, and then he has an M&M in his hand, and then
Hmm.
he appears again in the collage of all of the some of the 18 people. You'll on nine of those were part of the collage. So if you look at them, all of them are young boys, right? They're all young boys. And would we do this? Would you do this? Would you pick up? I mean, surprisingly, when you say would you do this, that's what they did, because Bush administration actually relaxed a lot of rules, so they could actually recruit white working class young boys who had barely graduated from high school to go to war. Right, so that also exists. So it's, yes, we do it, but we will do it to the same. So in every society, we think that certain people are expendable, and yeah, I don't none of them made it, right? None of them made it. I'm still alive and I'm talking about them, and these kids didn't make it. And how many childhoods have we sacrificed for these ideas of freedom and democracy, when who benefits from this freedom and democracy, right? um, and I mean, again, I don't know how to yeah, I don't know how to move from this. I went and I spoke and I saw all of this. I've written about this, and within a year, many of them died. They don't exist. I'm here, I'm talking. I don't know if this act of talking itself is going to make, or writing is going to make a difference, but that's what we've done. We've sacrificed so many children and their futures for these ideas that actually don't translate into anything.
How did your perspective about war evolved when you visited mm, these regions and similar regions?
War is ugly. No one wants it except for people who benefit from it. I can't, I don't think, I mean, when I say that war should not exist, people often say that I'm being very naive, or, oh, we need to protect our borders. You've had war, you've used violence. What have you protected? Again, this goes to the idea that we cannot continue living the way we are living right now. The world cannot go on like this. We can't continue fighting for ideas that really make no difference. India's own history. Imagine the millions of people who crossed these borders to create new homes for themselves. What trauma have we given to them? Um, we need to really rethink what this war means. What does bombing Syria today accomplish? What have we accomplished by bombing Syria today? I really want to know. Yesterday was also the day when the young girl who fled, who left Britain to go, Shamshira Begum's verdict came, and you've stripped citizenship of this young woman. She's flawed, yes, she did something, but also there's a reason why she left. There was a reason why she was indoctrinated. There was, instead of that, a young girl who's never had any connection to Bangladesh, who's never lived there, who's a British citizen, who traveled to ISIS held territory, who was probably then raped and sexually harassed, who now, as a child, has been stripped of British citizenship. what has your war achieved? I don't know has war achieved. Um, what are we fighting for? And I think that's important. And what do we want for the future? If anything, I think it's time for all of us to. I think it's a responsibility of the community, right? It's a community because often these things are done in our name. But the war missionary benefits only the people who create the weapons, not the people who fight, not the boys and girls and men and women and children and families and communities we sacrifice. If sacrifice is what is meant to keep a nation together, then perhaps we need to rethink the idea of what these nations mean.
It's very interesting, Suchitra, that and I think you have emphasized this in the book as well, that how possessive at times we are about these maps and borders, which are essentially a lot of times the white man's problem, where due to we have a lot in nations like India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, they have inherited a border which was probably due to issues of that time were not demarcated pretty well, and now nations, because to maintain their nationalism, will have to fight and defend their lands, and a lot of these borders are just nothing but plain barren lands, and nobody knows where it begins, and nobody knows sometimes where these borders begin and end, but countries are fighting big long wars around it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's true of almost, as early as, South Sudan was recently created, right? I think then you have Kosovo, that was the most recent nation state. But even today, Afghanistan and Pakistan don't agree on what the Durand line is or the legitimacy of it. We don't agree on what the Johnson line is when it comes to China. So, yes, I think these lines are meandering and shifting. And you wouldn't be surprised that at the height, if I'm not mistaken, I think what soon after Samara bombing, there were actually plans of breaking up Iraq. You know, they said, "Oh, you should, these are savages. We should just break them up." Not very different from the language it's always been used to talk about uh, brown and black colonized communities and what they've done for our lands. So yes, of course. But also another part of the book that is very important for me that I found across people is that people make their own maps. You can do everything in your capacity to do it, but people make their own maps. And this was something, I know in the first part chapter in Afghanistan too, I say, for a lot of Afghans when I met them in 2000, between 2010 and 2012, who were then in their 80s, the racial memory of a map, the cartographic memory of a map was not Pakistan, not even India as we understand it. For them, this entire space was this one contiguous land where travel and relationships moved. Of course, there's this famous story of the Kabuliwala of the student, where there's these people migrated, walked, migrated, traveled um, uh, with their goats and horses across these landscapes, and you'll find very similar stories from Palestine and from Lebanon, from almost any parts of the world. If you ask people who are in that age, many of them are now gone. The racial memory of was never first. The racial memory was never a racial memory of a border. It was always a frontier that was open to mixing, that was open, that was not so painful and violent. So I think it's very important for us to understand that we've also lost that sense of this capacity to travel, the capacity to explore, the capacity to live. It's not just explore not for the sake of wanderlust, but often people move. The greatest biblical story is a mother putting her son into the raft and putting him onto on the sea, so because the earth becomes unsafe, right? I think migration is what defines human civilization, and yet we've become so averse to it, or rather we have become so averse to a group of people who look a certain way, speak a certain way. We don't like them if they move, because then they can't move, they can only be objects that can be exploited.
There's one part in the book, Suchitra, where you mentioned that, and this is the starting only before the Sarasa story, that when ambiguity could not no longer protect people, I let their stories go. Would you like to talk about a story without taking the name, which did not made it to the book?
Uh, I wouldn't know where to begin.
It's a tough one.
There was one very painful story of this gentleman that I met, who lost his son, who didn't lose his son. His son was very violently taken away from him. His son was disappeared many year in the 90s. No, not in the 90s, in the end of the 90s. And he's talking about his son in the height of the insurgency, and his son disappears as a young boy, young man. But this father describes the moment when the family had to go to Delhi to get some medical treatment, and he describes his son who who was very young then. And this is the first time the family is this young boy is leaving Kashmir to go to Delhi for a treatment for his grandma. I don't remember the details. I think it was for his grandmother, if I'm not mistaken. And for the first time, the boy is surprised because there are no checkpoints in Delhi. And he tells his
Hmm.
father, Baba, why do we have checkpoints? Right? Why do we have checkpoints? When he's surprised, like, so the one thing the father remembers of his son, who again after this young man has already disappeared, and we are talking, and he shows me these legal petitions, the FIRs he's filed, the things that he's asked, and he's afraid that he's going to start forgetting his son. And I tell him towards the end, I say, no, what do you remember of him? Like, what are you? He says, like, he says, I'm afraid of forgetting. I'm afraid that I'm going to forget my son. I'm afraid that I won't remember anything about him except the fact how cruelly and violently he was taken away from us. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know where he is. I don't know if he's alive. I don't know if he's dead. If he's dead, I don't know if he's in a grave. I don't know if they chopped him up. I don't know if they dissolved him in an acid. I don't know what happened to my son. And the only thing I remember of my son is him telling me that, Baba, why do we have checkpoints? Um,
Hmm.
and I didn't have a, I didn't have a child then. I wasn't, I mean, I had my daughter after this conversation. That story didn't make it to the book. I was actually saying this story to my friend and one of the other founding members at Polis, Francesca, is it? We were discussing a pitch that came to us, and we read that pitch, and we said, Francesca, this reminds me of that story. And Francesca was like, oh my God, Suchitra, this is like so painful. And that's true. Baba, why do we have checkpoints? Imagine, that's the only thing you'll remember of your son. Again, it felt also like it felt like pain porn, At this point you're just recording pain. And I didn't know. I couldn't the story didn't make it for many reasons, and I still think of it. I have a child now, and I wonder what I would do if she was taken
Hmm.
away so violently from me. If I don't know, if the last thing I remember of her telling me is, Amma, why do we have checkpoints? I definitely wouldn't have the empathy or the kindness or the generosity of this man who, despite what as Indians we have done to them, had the kindness to speak to me. What that's always baffled me, right? We've do such violence to so many people, and yet their kindness and generosity, what makes it, what and again, this can very easily become pain porn. It can easily become a privileged woman going into these spaces documenting these painful stories. And no, I didn't want it to become that. At that point in time, my job is to stand in absolute solidarity with everybody who fights for freedom and dignity. Also, if this had happened to me, I would have burnt everything down. If this happened to my child, if someone took my child away in that way, would I go from pillar to post? Would I go from police station to police station? Would I go from judge to justice? No, I would burn everything down. And yet so many of them don't. That surprised me. That truly surprised me. I don't know if you have children, but if you
I
do,
don't.
then I don't know. Okay,
Hmm.
but I don't know. I mean, imagine, like, when I heard the story, I didn't. Now that I do, Yeah, if someone took my daughter away, I would burn everything down. But but here we are. We have taken so many things from so many people, and yet they are fighting. They're fighting. They have certain belief that their fight would one day be rewarded, that one day justice would come. We don't know if it would come. If history of this republic is to go by, chances are it won't. It's been 30 years since Kunan Pashpura. It's been longer than Killivan. There have been so many massacres, so many people lost, so many violations, so many rights taken away. So yeah, this is just one, there's just so many stories that didn't make it. And at some point in time, I said, I've seen enough pain. My job is not to, because it's very easy. This is another thing that I critique all the time, of privileged white people parachuting into black and brown spaces, writing about our pain and our misery, and then going away and being applauded for writing about it. None of us should be applauded for this. Now that we've seen this, everything we should do now should be to fight what is done in our name. So yeah, so there's so many stories that didn't make it.
Hmm. And Suchitra, I was also wondering when I was reading your book that uh, how do you manage to put yourself together, uh, witnessing these tragedies so upfront and up close? Uh, it must be difficult, right? And uh, I mean, I was just trying to look the world through your eyes, and going to places and speaking to people who have lost close loved ones. uh, uh, it's very, it must be very, very tough. Tell me about the, tell me about those nights initially when you would hear those stories, and you'd go back to bed thinking about those stories probably.
The sad thing is, I have episodic memory. I don't forget. It's very few things I forget. That it's a curse. It's a curse more than a gift. I have episodic memory, which means that every time I see or witness something, I remember it, and I can replay everything. I remember everything. I remember the smell, the space, what someone was wearing. Sometimes I do forget certain things. For example, in one of the chapters, my editor was like, is this Dilon or Dylan? And I was like, I don't know. I what I remember is one thing, what I wrote it down was another. So we went with what I wrote down. But beyond those small things here and there, I actually remember everything. I never forget. There are very few things I forget. So that makes it incredibly difficult for me. It's later I was told that some people just have very vast episodic memory. People just and I'm one of those people. I don't forget anything. There are very few things I forget. um and I also dream a lot of these things. So it's been incredibly difficult. It's been um again, I don't want to make this about me, because it's not about me. It's hard. It's difficult. I've aged. Like I mean, I mean, it's true. I've aged. My partner is a little older than me, and I swear he looks younger than me now at this point in time. Um,
Mhm.
he's already in his 40s. I'm not, but still, I sometimes look at him and I say, dude, I'm gonna look so much older than you in just a few more years. And this last year has aged me. It's hard. It's sometimes I don't know what to do with, more than the pain. I don't know what to do with my anger.
Mm.
My anger
Mm.
gets my yeah my anger. I don't know what to do with my anger. I don't know what to do
and
with my righteous indignation.
and also that feeling of helplessness, that what can we do, or, or can we really do something or not? Do you also feel that?
Never hopeless, but always angry, because I know what I can do. I used to feel hopeless when I was younger, because I didn't know. I didn't have the maturity. I definitely didn't have. Um, at least now I know there's certain things I can do. You know, if if someone say needs some resources today, perhaps I have access to certain resources that I can pass on, which I didn't have 10 years ago.
Mm.
I know that my job, I am very clear about what I would do. I'm very clear about the things that I speak to. I will speak truth to power. Um not speak truth to power. It sounds so so contrived these days to even say that. I know that I will always speak up against the powerful. I will never speak on behalf of those who have been. My job is not to speak on behalf of everyone. My job is to use my immense privilege to do it. There are things I won't do and things I will do. In that sense, I know what I can do within that, and I'll keep doing that. And I know it's because people
Mm.
like me, so not people like me, I know that people did this, and that this is why I have. The reason Suchitra Vijayan was born as a citizen of a free, independent, secular, democratic republic was because hundreds of thousands of men like my grandfather and women did things that came together. So I know I'm happy to be a footnote in history and do that. So I know what the footnote's job is. So not helpless.
Mm.
Angry,
Well said.
yes. Angry, yes, I'm
Mm.
angry. I'm angry. I'm very angry. I've never been this angry.
Mm.
Sometimes sad, yes, but I don't allow myself to be helpless or hopeless. That I never allow myself to be. Fear, yes, I fear for my daughter. I fear what we will leave behind for her. I don't want her I would never want her to choose between her love, a desire, and life. If my daughter is, say, falls in love with a woman tomorrow, I want her to fall in love without shame. She falls in love with someone else who has a different color, different race, different religion. I want her to fall in love. If she wants to pursue something, I want her to work hard for it. And if she is deserving, I want her to work hard and be rewarded. I don't want her to get something because she's my daughter. I don't want her to get something because she's a child of privilege. At the same time, I don't want her to be denied of something because she is a daughter of brown immigrants to this country. She's still a brown girl. I don't want the state to legislate on her body. She should decide who she wants to sleep with or what she wants to do tomorrow if she wants to have a child. She has to decide. I said this last year and everybody was laughing at me before the so called love jihad nonsense happened. I said, I don't know if tomorrow it will be safe for my daughter to return to this country if, God forbid, she fell in love with a Muslim boy or a Muslim girl. And everybody was making fun of me. I said, no, 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 Suchitra, what are you talking about? No, I really don't know. I really don't know what will happen of her. And this is given my daughter's privilege, right? Because my daughter still is immensely privileged. Yet, her privilege will no longer protect her. But imagine what happens if you don't come with all of my daughter's privilege and you still have to do all of this. We are killing people for those who they choose to love. We are arresting people for just trying to send flirty messages on. We've criminalized the most beautiful of human emotions, the capacity to flirt, to fall in love, to desire, to eat the food we like, right? That I'm very angry about. And I'm still believe that I can't believe you're still fighting for this at this point in time. But yes, I'm angry, but never helpless. I try not to. But also, you have to train yourself to be not become helpless. It's some days are harder. I think I don't know because you live in India. I don't know how harder it is for you. So maybe I should ask you the same question as well. Do you feel helpless?
Um, I do, but I often ask this question myself that what is my role in all this, and what is my part in all this, uh, and my philosophy is you need to recognize your role in any movement that you're associated with, and then you need to depart. So my podcast is also sort of me playing a role in this larger movement of liberty, justice, and equality uh, that we are still fighting for uh, after all these years after independence. So
No,
yeah,
you're
that's how I look
absolutely
at
right.
things.
No, I think it's a wonderful way to look at things, right? Because Do what you do. It's something my mom would say. My mom would say that. She's always said this. My mom is a more pragmatic one. Perhaps I believe I'm more like her than anybody else. She'd always say that do what you can and let it be. You do your
Hmm.
best, right? You do your best. And don't do it for anything else. Don't do it for personal enrichment. Don't do it for anything else. You want to do good, just do good. She will say, if you give 10, the other day she was saying, this was very funny. She's saying that, she said, apparently somebody had donated 500 rupees for something and they had posted it on Facebook. And my mom was like, why do people do this? You can actually give 5,000 and keep doing it and be very quiet about it, you know?
Hmm.
So she was thinking about this, thinking out loud about why do people do this. She says that don't do this. You do something, you do it quietly and keep doing it as long as you can. And I think that is true. But we don't. But without expectations, right? Without any expectations that something would come out of it, because today we cannot see the impact of the things we do today, but they will have an impact. And conversations are a political act. Giving money is a political act. So I think we should all keep doing what we can, and that's very important and very consistently, right? It's like running a marathon. This is going to be a long, long fight. It's going to be the fight of our lifetime, which means that you do it quietly every single day, and that takes a lot of training. You, like, just as you train for a marathon, you have to train to be hopeful. You have to train to hold on to your empathy. Uh, you have to train yourself, and I think that is still something that I am struggling with. I'll openly say it, I struggle with it all the time.
Hmm. Suchitra, moving on your journey, and yeah, would like to talk about Panitar now. In
Mm-hmm.
Sundarbans, near
Mm-hmm.
Sundarbans, West Bengal, Bangladesh. And this is particularly important because here we can actually understand the backdrop of CANRC, and it is
Mm-hmm.
completely visible to the naked eye. The way you have described these
Mm-hmm.
stories, that even
Mm-hmm.
a BSF Jawan would look at a refugee who is fighting for their life, who probably been persecuted, who is probably demanding some kind of a refuge, but he would look at it and say, "Oh, illegal immigrant."
Mm-hmm.
And tell me what you saw in that border, and tell me about your observations there.
I think this part of the travel started in 2013. So this was much before NRC, right? So this is also like,
Hmm.
the second thing is, I didn't know these spaces, right? I was in some ways learning about these spaces in ways that I didn't know. One thing that really stood out for me is the ways in which we had created identities. We had very strictly it's we had created so many fictions of who belongs where, how do we place them. And I think that was the most important thing, that somehow these lines that nobody quite knew how to demarcate, how to think, had become more important than the people themselves. So I think that's one of the other things. Second is the way in which, we saw people, right? There is this moment where the guy, they bring the thing and he says, "Oh, this is not Indian cola. This is Bangla cola." And I'm like, what? I mean, what does it even mean? What does it? Um,
Hmm.
and in these parts of the world, people had both IDs. They were not having these two IDs because they were trying to cheat the system. Like, what system can you cheat? They had these IDs because they were securing their son. They're securing themselves, right? They were securing themselves because they didn't know what would happen next. You could, of course, see this as criminal. You could see this as, oh my god, these people are coming to take everything. Or you could see this as people who are trying to fight for the basic dignities that were already enshrined to them but were not given to them, right? Imagine that young girl walking, going to school and coming back, but had to go through a checkpoint every single day. Or looking at women and thinking, oh my god, these women are only here for smuggling. or then saying that, oh, they're all complicit, they're all honeypots, they're all, why is it? Or saying that, oh, they all use cough syrup to get high. You treat everybody like a suspect, not as not even so. Instead of treating someone as a citizen, we have successfully eroded their rights into a subjecthood. From being a subjecthood, now we treat everybody as a suspect, right? And that's what the NRC and CAA does. It's treating everybody as a suspect before we can decide who gets our benevolent declarations of citizenship, without understanding the deep human consequences of it. I think Ghazi's story is one of the first stories I actually sat down and had and wrote. And I mean, imagine if you're, there's this moment where he kind of rattles off a list of things you can get, the smuggled objects. What are people smuggling? They're smuggling cattle, sugar, rice, chilies, batteries, radios. They're smuggling in, like, medication. Their birth control. The question is not, oh my god, the smuggling is criminal. The thing is, why are people actually smuggling these objects? Why is it that these objects are not available to them? What political and social economies conspire to deprive people of the most fundamental things that these have to be smuggled in, right? um, or the way in which we think it's okay to unilaterally kill people for the act of crossing, right? I think long before the NRC, I think our nation, I think India was struggling to, you know, hold all of its diverse people. And I think that struggle was playing out even as early. I mean, I would say much earlier, but I only got there at this time.
Mm, it's very interesting. I think that one part in which Ghazi says that the partition did not just happen and the war did not just happen. It is unfinished, incomplete, and ongoing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And and it's true. I mean, though we were divided all these years back, but the memories of partition is still very much alive. The feeling that this is us and this is them is pretty much
Mm-hmm.
alive. And that is the fault line which probably politicians and political parties are now exploiting. It is not that they have created these fault lines, they were always present. They now recognized it and they want to use it to their political gains. That is the difference now.
Mm-hmm. Of course, these fault lines exist. I mean, we killed people and we all danced around their bodies. Come on. Like, when I say we, I say as various communities. My
Hmm.
friend Asim Rafiki, he's a who's also part of Police Project, and Pakistani Swedish. He's a Pakistani American Swedish photographer. He says this to me, and he said this to me once. He said, he said, Suchitra, so much violence happened, and now we've reduced the violence. Like, he said that we've inflicted so much violence, you know, uh, and yet now we talk about this nostalgia for home. We drove people out of Pakistan. He says this. He says this all the time. He says we drove people out of Pakistan, and now we are nostalgic for something. What the fuck are we nostalgic for? Excuse my words. But the
Hmm.
reality is that, yes, people who were neighbors and friends took part in some very violent things, and communities across the board were affected, right? And that's going to leave a huge mark. It's going to leave a traumatic imprint on you. Now, how do we deal with this violence and trauma? How do we remember? How do we pass on? How do we move? Um, it's a function of, if the violence was an act of community, healing must be an act of community. At some point in time, we should stop. We should stop, and we should actually figure things out, because it's painful. And in Natasha's chapter, I quote another friend who's also Pakistani, who's Shia Pakistani, who says, you pack a bag and the bag always stays. You always stayed packed, right? So she says,
Correct.
how, They moved, yes, but her nieces were born here. And why do they also have it? The sense that no matter how many places you move, there's always a metaphorical su- suitcase packed and kept in your living room. I mean, not the real one, but you always feel that something might happen and you might have to move. And she says, Suchitra, nobody should live under an authoritarian regime. We lived through that.
Mm,
And in my
yeah.
experience, and I can't speak for the experience of others, almost all Pakistanis I've spoken to have two things: a sense of self awareness that Indians don't have. As Indians, I think we don't have any self awareness, of few people might. But Pakistanis know, at least the ones I speak to, have an immense sense of self awareness of how the freedom and the nation that they got was squandered away by not having a constitution, by not having the deterioration into authoritarianism, and how they lived through it, how they continue to live through it. Natasha says this. Fauzia says this. They know what they lost, and they say, we had nothing, so we had to throw our bodies. And second, that they do and have is an immense sense of generosity for the Indian brethren. Natasha says that every time I see Indians, I want to let them know that we've gone through this. We don't want you to go through this.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
They say this, but I don't see that same. Maybe it's also my own bias, so I'm just letting it out to say that this is my experience. This might not have to. Why is that? Because I think that is a moment of engagement. If Natasha and I can sit across from each other and have this conversation and learn from each other, can't the far more well equipped nation states do something very similar? How many years are we going to keep people away from? I know families in Pakistan who have entire ancestors buried in Amroha. They talk about the nose everybody in Amroha has. She said that everybody in Amroha has this very peculiar nose, and if you see that nose, you can map them. I've heard these stories. Again, no, those stories also did make it into the book. Um, yeah, I think that's the thing. I think it's for us. I don't want to take away from your loss or your violence that any of these communities have endured. I don't want to take that away from them. It's their pain, it's their trauma. But I'm sure there's a way for us to not pass this on. How do we do that? That has to be a community conversation. Definitely not helping when someone says Goli Maro Salon ko. Doesn't help when somebody is called the children of Tipu Sultan. So what if you're a children of Tipu Sultan? In the sense that why is it that we are taking these moments of history out of its historical trajectory and placing them? Everything doesn't have to be communalized. I'm a South Indian. I mean, I'm no, I mean, I'm part Tamilian, and there's one food that we all Tamilians eat, is our rasam rice. Rasam as hing, right? But do you know that hing is only grown in Afghanistan? Hing is never grown in India. The only place in the world hing is grown is Afghanistan. So
Oh, really?
from the mountains of Hindu Kush, hing has made its way all the way down to the Chola Chera coats for food that we eat, right? Tomatoes, not indigenous to our country, but yet that is who we are. The food we eat is so cosmopolitan. Like tomato rasam, hing comes from Afghanistan, tomato comes from somewhere else. Only the pepper is indigenous to us in some ways, right? So yet the food we eat, the simplistic food of garlic and tomato and hing boiled in a mix of spices and tamarind water, is so cosmopolitan. It is a mix of so many cultures, so many foods, so many geographical, cartographic movements. We are all that, right? So, how do we then? So, that is also healing, right? So, in that sense, I think it's time. I think it's time because, look, this is not like some kind of, oh my God, it's time for us to make up. Peace is not some kind of imagination. If we have to live, if we have to remove the hate that has been constantly pumped into the body politic of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. We really need to stop now, because what is left if all that is left of us is hate? This is not some kind of artsy fartsy question. It's a genuine question. We won't, this is political also, right? You won't give someone your house, you won't marry your daughter off, you, the food you eat. They will communalize and make hate every single part of our life. They've already done it. But can you live like this? I don't think we can. If this goes on, we are going to see destruction of not one nation but many nation, and along with it many communities. And I think that is, I think, the crucial part. I hope this is something that people think for themselves. I also, the book, I hope, one of the things I tried was not to pontificate through the book. I've told these stories. I've taken all the theoretical stuff, the difficult stuff, the pedagogic stuff, all of it. I cleansed this book of it. I try to keep the language as simple as possible. I try to tell the stories as honest as possible. But never, I've hoped, I mean, I could be wrong. You have to tell me that. I've hoped that I'm not thrusting my views on people. I'm simply telling them what happened, and it's for them to take away from it what they want to. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm holding people accountable, but I'm not pointing fingers. But allowing people to see the humanity in these stories, I'm hoping is one of those ways for us to move forward.
There's this specific incident in your book, and I found it very funny, but also it speaks volume about the thought process of the Indian right wing. This is the Kotwali Darwaza, and you.
Yes, yes.
Yes, so for those who are listening, so you are at Kotwali Darwaza along with the BSF guard. It's probably it's a 13, 15, 18 AD old sort of a monument, and then here comes a couple, and the husband goes out, climbs it, and shouts, "Bharat Mata ki Jai! I salute our armed force. Our soldiers will take back what was denied to us in the partition. There was this once a Hindu temple that the Muslims had palace and built upon their forts." I mean, I can only imagine in that, like, in that sort of a land, and this scene taking place. So, I mean, yeah.
This was just before the all of look, all of this happens before BJP came to power, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is not now. This was before BJP comes to power. This was just before BJP comes to power in 2014. So even, and I also understand that in 2013-14, this, the video had started, but video kind of uh, this kind of videos were just beginning to be made.
Hmm.
But also, what's very funny is how the other guard there is so perplexed. He's like, he's just, it's the guard who says, I don't say anything. Asim Bhai doesn't say anything in this. And it's the guard who says, he's just like, dude, just go down and see, he's like, what are you going on about? Because the guard was also taken aback, right? He's like, uh, yeah, it was one of those, look, there's also the other moment, right, in that incident, is that it's also the sexualizing of the Muslim male body, right? Because they also say, this the guards are looking at me, and they look at me and they say, they're looking at Asambai and saying, are you guys out on your date or something? It's so weird, it's so cringy, right? Because uh this sexualization of the Muslim male body, I think that that was also, that's something that happens, this sense that a man and a woman, um, in a place like this, cannot be two people just traveling, right? It has to be, there has to be
Some.
something illicit about
Mm.
it, of course. And then it's very simple, because but now we hear these exact same arguments now being, um I read this on Twitter, and I just started laughing about how this one, I think she's an RSS BJP politician or some local panchayat leader. She says, the reason why love jihad happens is because Muslim men know how to pleasure Hindu women, and I'm like, Jesus Christ, what is? But again, that is not very different from the ways in which we have sexualized Muslim bodies. We have either these are sexual bodies, or these are bodies in which through on which we can impact and inflict violence. But that couple, oh my god, I'm, I'm still wondering if I'm, the other day I was actually wondering, uh maybe this couple will read this book and reach out to me, and say, hey, we were the couple. And I don't know, it was such a weird moment, though. It sounds funny now, but that moment was just absolutely odd and weird. And yeah.
Hmm. And uh, I, I kept on thinking, and tried to kept on visualizing what it is like to be there, what it is like to be a village there, what it is like to be, a child being, being raised in that part of the region. And it was not a very, very lovely sight. I mean, it was very weird. Tell me about something that you observed about around the way people live their life, the families, the kids. uh, what was it like?
In some ways, um, I really tried not to make this into, oh my God, these are so exceptional that these spaces are so different from us. No, there a lot of these families do what all of us try to do. We want to live comfortably, live with enough, and live securely. Having said
Mm.
that, these spaces are also getting militarized in ways that which we cannot understand. You see that in Ghazi's story, you see that in Ali's story, that the rupture happens. You keep pushing people, and they try. I keep thinking about these little vines that I have in my house. Um, every time I move them around, they always find their way towards the sun. Similarly, we keep enclosing people, we keep enclosing them, we keep depriving them of things, and yet they find ways to live. They find ways to survive, they find ways to live with dignity. But the point is, and with courage, because it takes immense courage to do this every single day. It's exhausting. If Imagine if hearing these stories makes one so exhausted, imagine living this life. And again, I don't want to be in a position where I'm talking on behalf of any of these people. So I'm going to do what I always do, which is to say, critique the institutions, the bureaucracies, the state that seem only interested in depriving people of what they have. And it's not an easy way. And it's not a life that one we should be proud of. No nation is worth guarding at the cost of the people you claim to guard or claim to protect. And that's what we're doing right now. It doesn't matter how many people, I mean, I don't think we look at anyone who is not us as worthy of the same respect and love that we deserve. And in these spaces, as I said, you are constantly remaking these spaces. You're constantly creating violent spectacles in these spaces. Uh, there are children, in the Felani story, you hear that, you know, um, children here know, it's part of their lullabies and bedtime stories as cautionary tales, of how not to stray too close to the border fence. It's painful, and I think that's what we've created. And I think it's time for us to. So these, I think, the point for me is to always say that these are not. We should not look at these incidences outside. These are not just stories. These stories and these violence is enabled because of a structural reason. There is an entire institution that guards this behavior. There's an entire bureaucracy that defends this behavior. There's an entire group of people who make decisions and put into place policy positions that have no reflection on what's happening on the ground. And I think those are the kind of things that we need to critique. and look at.
I'm not very good at remembering names, so I think there was also this one story where I think it was Ali who takes you to meet his friend, who's living in a very closed area near the border, and his house is surrounded by complete uh, floodlights,
Yes,
and
Jamshed takes me to meet Ali. Yeah.
Jamshed takes you to meet Ali. Correct, correct. Tell me about that. I think, and tell me about that whole experience.
Oh, that this was the hardest, one of the hardest things for me to write, because at first I was like, I'm not going to write it. It took me 3 years to write this chapter, and I think this is the most painful story, which also is a reflection of everything that has happened. I think Ali's story is also a story of how the region transformed, how every transformation affected his life in ways we cannot understand. It's also a story of ecological disaster, how these areas that are made of water and showers were ecologically destroyed to create these border fencing. Also, understand that border fencing is not just a security measure, it's also an environmentally, ecologically unsustainable measure. For instance, every year during in Kashmir, or especially in Gurez and other areas, every year before the winter, you have these concertina wires being put up. Snow falls, snow melts, and these wires are washed away into the riverbeds, waterbeds. So these sharp wires are there, which constantly now affect people who cross, who do. Similarly, these border fencing projects are ecologically problematic. Not problematic, they're ecologically
Disastrous.
very disastrous. And yet we are putting metal and wire in these spaces. Second, no sense of what's happening. And if you look at Ali's story, it's also that we the policies we put in place means that the border doesn't start where the border actually starts, which means the fencing starts in a very different space, which kind of destroys livelihoods. It runs through many things. So, of course, you're putting these things in place without any consideration. Imagine having go through a border gate to just reach your fence. Second, these floodlighting projects. All of them are one, politically, ecologically, socially irresponsible, but also unsustainable. And in his case, you can see how his life kind of gets um destroyed. You can see that fence transforming from a porous border to a fence that kills. Of course, the story of his wife also. Um, how this migration is. I know there was so many things that I didn't learn. I didn't realize that women. There was a network through which women were married off. Some of these women traveled from small villages in Bangladesh all the way to Kutch to be married off. Not only
Hmm.
to Madhya
Yeah.
Pradesh, and I didn't know this. I was just because Kay's sister does that, right? Because Kay's sister, as a sister, actually moves not only from Bangladesh all the way to the Gujarat side. Apparently, it's a very common practice. And I found this in Afghanistan as well. In Paktika province, a lot of the men had traveled as far as from Paktika province to UP, Hyderabad to bring Indian wives back. Um, and a lot of the boys in Paktika province had Indian mother, or at least Indian Muslim mothers from UP and Madhya Pradesh and Hyderabad. This happens in Sudan too. I know in a lot of Muslim Sudanese men also travel to Hyderabad to marry. So it's these moments, but I didn't know this. I didn't know this aspect of marriage and migration as an important part of the practice of how these various women move across these landscapes. Also, what happens to her? How they get into smuggling. They're told that because there's no money, right? All the money is gone. How do you make money? You try making money by all kinds of means. And in this case, they're told, you have to go here, get something, come back. Here, it is not a question of criminality, it's a question of livelihood. And often, you're criminalizing livelihoods simply because of who these people are and not what they do. Um, of course, the real part is when when he starts living, he can't dream anymore, he can't see anymore, he can't starts having hallucinations. And of course, the moment when I saw the photograph that Jamshed had shared with me of his wedding, Ali was an incredibly good looking young man, but by the time I saw him, I couldn't recognize him. I couldn't recognize that this was a man who looked like this a few years ago, whose entire body had eroded, you know. And this is not the first time. I saw this with so many people. Photographs of them before all of this happened to them. Yeah, this was a very, very difficult story to write, and about just before the book went to print, Ali went missing. He hasn't been found yet. We don't know where he is. So yeah, that's where we are.
And Ali crossed the border accidentally, right? From what I recall.
No, Ali doesn't cross the border accidentally. His wife crosses the border to get married. They
Hmm,
used to
hmm.
cross the border before the fencing. It was very normal for them to cross the
Normal for them to cross the border.
because
Okay,
your
yeah.
aunt lives down there. That was very common. Even with Ghazi, if you see, there's a small river. There's still parts of the Bangladesh border that are very porous. Even where Ali lives, even though they've, as you see, they've claimed large parts of these char lands, and they've built these borders. But eventually, because water finds its way, these parts are eroded, and you can actually dunk inside these marshy lands, and you can still cross out. Um, but yeah, but there are other stories of people just by mistake finding themselves on the other side, because there are still
Hmm.
vast parts of the border that is not that is still porous or can easily be crossed into, despite it becoming a very dangerous and violent border.
Tell me, and let's now move to another interesting, area. It's Tawang, and I
Mm.
think this is also sort of a region which is still sort of you can still see the impact of the 62 war here. And yeah, tell me, how was Tawang? How was it very different, completely unconnected from the mainland, the narratives that are present, and the feelings of people there?
Um, Upfront, Tawang is also the place that I spend the least amount of time with. And I feel that this is also the chapter that I feel I'm the most unhappy with this chapter, because one, I couldn't put in everything that I wanted to because of a lot of other reasons people want to pulled away from the stories. So the Tawang chapter is also a chapter that doesn't have one cohesive story. It's also a chapter that I'm not most happy with in terms of how it came out.
Hmm.
But I think the most important thing for us to understand is that two things. One is how the 1962 war is told to us without understanding the history of the past. And I was very surprised a lot of this is also, I think this is also the most archival part of the work. I was very surprised when I found out that, you know, um, there was something very similar that happens before the 1961 war, right? In 1951, um, the Indian army is sent to Tawang. Uh, and what happens there is very interesting, because they go uh, and it's a way for them to say that they want to make sure that Tawang is integrated into India. And it's very interesting that when they say, act as if this is the most natural order of things. And of course, there is there's a massacre where these you go into this place, and then there's a massacre, and then in return there is another follow-up attack. And in um, there's this moment, when I was very surprised. There's a question that is put to Nehru in the parliament about the NEFA policy. And he's asked, would the prime minister be justified in taking action against the Tajins, who do not consider themselves as Indian citizens and lived in an unadministered area outside the control of Indian state? I mean, imagine, even when we are having this conversation in 1951, a question in the Indian parliament is being put to the prime minister saying that, do you think that these actions are okay, given that the Tajin tribe doesn't consider themselves to be Indian citizens and they have always lived unadministered by us? And then Nehru says, oh, the Tajins might not see themselves as Indian citizens, but that does not mean that the area was outside Indian territory. I was completely blown away by this, saying that you acknowledge that these people don't, you acknowledge that these people don't think of themselves as Indians first. Second, you also acknowledge that these people have lived unadministered in a region that was not, I mean, India didn't even exist. Tajin tribes have existed long before the nation state of India has existed. And yet you think that you can have a claim to this land, which is not very different from how we see all of India's bordered spaces and populations who still, in some ways, struggle and fight against the Indian hegemony. So, designating a group of people as Indian citizens who either were not Indian citizens or never consider themselves, but doing it by force, I think that is one part of it, which is not, it's something that we continue to hold on to. And second is the discovery of Karunakar Gupta's work, which I was again very surprised, which basically shows that India's entire claim to this region is based on a forged map.
Correct. That was very surprising.
I was like, and this book exists. You can all, I've now managed to collect all of Karunakar Gupta's work. My library has all of his work. I have his books. I have printed every single thing he's ever written. I have his entire archive. I've rebuilt I've tried to rebuild Karunakar Gupta's entire archive back. I have all of this. So this is available. That's why, if you look at the bibliography, you can actually go and look at all of his work. If you search, you can find his work.
Yeah, and you say this very clearly that the newly independent India inherited a fabricated border, and Gupta believed that Prime Minister Nehru was misled by his reliance on the forged British papers about the McMahon Line. I
Yeah,
mean, why on earth were we fighting the 1962 war then?
exactly. my And we still continue to, right? We still uh continue to. And I think that's the important part of it. And I think one of the things I hope to do is, I'm actually, if I know, the thing is that I'm actually trying to find an intern who could actually help me scan all of this and just put it up on a public archive, hopefully not offending any copyright thing, just so that more Indians have access to all of these maps. That way, I really don't want, I've tried in this part, writing this book, is to not preach. I don't want to preach to anyone. I just want to put whatever is available in public domain for people, and I want people to be able to take a look at it, and think for themselves and ask the exact same questions, right? On what basis are we going to this war? On what basis are we continuing to lose men, depriving families of fathers and mothers, over perhaps a map that was forged? Again, this is that's why, if you look at it, this book has every single line, or most of the lines on this book, on this chapter, is footnoted, simply because
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure that people had the footnote, they could go back, look it for themselves. Again, um, I've said this is what Gupta says, and this is all the work that Gupta has done, and this is all the work that is there for you to go look up for yourself. I'm still going through Gupta's work, and hopefully I hope to write something about it, just as a follow up, simply because, as I said, there's just so much that didn't go into the book. And also, I'm learning. I wrote this book to learn. I wrote this book because I didn't know, and there's just so much I found out that just completely surprised me, but also puts my own sense of things to um, test.
Mm. And this line, I think I find it very interesting. You said that a real accounting of the 62 war never occurred, at least not in India. For such an accounting would also lead to important question on Indian culpability, I'm sorry, and require the country to reflect on its ongoing propaganda practices. Uh, so, I mean, we fought a war, we lost a war, but we have never thought to just reflect why we went to war. and what was it all about. And
True.
yeah.
And it also cannot end with Nehru was wrong. Of course, Nehru was wrong.
Hmm, hmm,
But that was 1962. What
hmm,
happened was not he was wrong, but also there's a series of other mistakes that we've made, right? There's a series of mistakes that are being made now as we speak in the line of control, especially in Ladakh, especially in other spaces. So I think, look, every year, I mean, forget the right wing propaganda. Every year, 1962 war, look at how NDTV and your CNN, IBN, and all of those guys cover it. These great liberals. How do they cover this war? The same jingoism, right? How does Barka Dutt report on Kashmiris? She says both the soldiers and the people have human rights. I'm like, what? I mean, the point I'm saying is that this is not a. I want to be very clear that this book I've tried to hold everybody powerful in this country accountable. I'm not sympathetic towards the Congress, but I'm definitely not blaming them alone. We're all complicit. It's not just right wing propaganda. The left liberals of this country have done just as much damage in ways that still they continue to do. And I think that is important, that who gets to tell the story of our nation? And sadly, it's still the same people. It's sadly still the same people. It's a handful of people who control our social world and how these stories get told. And my question is always is that why are these people still telling these stories? And I think that has very dire consequences for democracy, but also the future of this republic.
hmm. Very correct. There's also a funny line that you have mentioned. That stories retold from memory are fraught with false stats, confusion, and a sense that the person is trying to fathom the past in words. Here, everyone I spoke to responded in perfect sound bites. In these, an old war was being retold. The fact changed a little, timelines meandered, and by the time I was done with the interviews, it felt like India had indeed won the 62 war.
Yes. Yeah, because that's what that does, right? Because the political economy of reporting. Every year you send every year for the anniversary of these wars, you send n number of people to this n number of places. They all meet the exact same guy, or now maybe there are four more guys. They all put you in touch with the same people. The function of fixer economy, right? The fixer economy of reporting. They all tell the same stories. And I'm sure even the guys who do the graphics for all of these TV channels are the exact. Sometimes I actually think that there's one guy who does the graphics for all of these TV channels, and the exact same music. Uh, that's another problem, right? The problem is that we have absolutely no sense of visual political aesthetics of how we tell stories. And also NDTV, not NDTV, Sudhir Chaudhary said in an interview that my job is to report in favor of the nation. I'm like, what does it even mean to report in favor of the nation? Whose nation? Right? Like, he says, I do nationalistic reporting. I'm like, what does it even mean when you say bullshit like this? Who is the nation? Like, I mean, is it the people? Is it the politicians? Is it the. Or when NDTV was told that it was anti national for reporting on Kashmir, they said, oh, no, 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 we report on the basis of, as in. No, as a reporter, you have no allegiance to a nation state. Your allegiance is to the truth as much as you can. But
Very well said.
what do we have? Look, I'm not, again, I'm really, the problem is that it's not RSS, BJP, right wing. These are all very problematic. But these people did not grow in a vacuum. They grew in the
Correct.
complicity of so much of the liberal left politics of India that is so vacuous, so casteist, so misogynistic, so gatekeeping, so deeply entrenched in their own enrichment. So when the BJP says and talks about nepotism, that is not wrong. Not that they don't do it. That is still very true. Let's take a list of every single Indian media editor right now, English language media right now. Let's map their caste, class, and affiliation hierarchies. You will think India is still a feudal society. They are all children of someone. They all come from immense privilege of wealth and caste and class. Then how do we, how, and yet, and they are a small handful of people who do not reflect the experiences of the vast majority of this country's people. And yet, we have so willingly bequeathed to them the right and the idea to define our social worlds. Why? Right? And I remember when the Nidhi Razdan's recent thing happened, somebody said, only someone who grew up with immense privilege and never had to fight for a single thing in their life can believe that Harvard will just email you and give you a job. For everyone else, it's a fight.
Hmm.
That's true. For a lot of us, it's a fight. Yes, I come from I'm born to an upper caste father, Hindu upper caste father, but I don't belong to this pedigree. There's not a single, for writing this book, I applied to so many fellowships. I didn't get a single fellowship to write this book. I applied to the India Foundation Fellowship. I applied every fellowship I applied to. I never got it. And I would often wonder, early days, is that am I not getting this because my work is not good? You know, even with my pedigree in terms of just someone who went to good universities or what I've done, it was not enough. It is still not enough, because I don't belong to that. And later, when I met my other friends who come from backgrounds, who had struggled, hustled to get their way into these backgrounds, who don't come from these elite backgrounds, who then make their ways into schools like, say, the National Law School or, say, St. Stephen's, the stories that they tell me about how the kids who come from privileged backgrounds would actually make fun of their language, would make fun of their accents because they didn't speak in a South Delhi accent. How a lot of these kids who didn't come from privilege were bullied or continue to be bullied. That some of India's elite spaces can only hold their own. They are very traumatic, very violent, and very exclusionary places, even for people who make it. And I think the greatest gift my parents ever gave me was send me out of the country at 17. If I had studied in one of these schools, I would not have survived it, simply because of how deeply casteist, racist, and classist these places are. So some of the stories I've heard, I mean, I hope my friends then one day open up and speak about this. Because it's not my job to tell their stories. Is that even those who made it to these elite, exclusive places, if you came without that privilege, I was so mortified to hear that in as early, like just in early 2000s, a lot of these people were actually bullied by these kids. And some of these bullies are also now writers and journalists in some very prestigious magazines in this country. Then imagine what stories we are getting. Just imagine. Do you think that their stories are not affected by their caste, class privileges or their misogyny? So I think that's another reason. And I'm being very candid also because I think we are in a place where there's nothing to lose. The other day I said something and somebody was like, Suchitra, your first book is out. Don't be so candid. What if they don't? I'm like, I don't care. I mean, they never gave me the money to write this book. That didn't stop me from writing this book. And after having done this, I perhaps have more of a responsibility to speak as much of the truth as I can, as I see it, because I also have access to these two different worlds, right? So I hopefully that I hope I've done that in a way that either doesn't make me look like a victim, because I'm not a victim. So I'm also going to be very clear about why someone like me got to write this book was also sheer privilege. But if I belong to that pedigreed class, maybe it wouldn't have taken me 8 years. Maybe it would have taken me 3 or 4 years. Maybe it wouldn't have taken so many turn downs and rejections. Maybe I would have never been rejected. And somebody also, I mean, I want people to know that this book was rejected by almost everybody, um, before it found a home. It took a while for this book to find a home, and I think I want people to know that this was. And again, I want to say it in a way in which I don't want to paint myself as a victim or someone who's deprived of resources. No, that's not the case. But even with all of my resources, it was not an easy book to write. So imagine how almost impossible it is for someone who doesn't come from any of my privilege to say write a book like this.
And I think you have very well dissected, I mean, the spaces, the elite spaces of Delhi. And I think when Arnab Goswami comes on the prime time and he shouts Lutyens Delhi, Lutyens Delhi, so much of it may be a rhetoric, but it does rings a bell in vast majority of the population, because they have probably uh, you know the gatekeepers of these, of the Lutyens Delhi, probably have made them feel, you know not so good at some point in time.
It's not about not so good, you know. I mean, I'm in my 30s. I understand that, you know, feelings get hurt. I think what you have to understand is that our country is set up in a way in which it is set up to serve a elite select few, not everybody.
Hmm. It's not an inclusive,
It is
space
not
with
an
which,
yeah.
yeah,
And that is why
includes everyone.
everybody has to fight to get where they are, and once they get to where they are, because they fought to get there, they don't want anyone to get there.
Hmm.
Imagine if I had to apply and try and struggle and meet with, say, 25 agents to get one agent, and I finally have an agent. Why would I automatically open up my agent and say, oh my God, here you go? Right? Uh, this is something that I do, very things that now when people reach out to me and say, hey, can you connect me to someone? My first thing, I'll always connect people to everybody else. When someone says, hey, can you connect me to your agent? I do. I every year I try say, you know, I also check with my agent to see, because I also don't want to send a million people her way. I tell her, you know, can I, because somebody was that generous to me, right? Because when I didn't have access to one, and I was feeling so upset. Either the agents were all rejecting me, or the agents who liked me were had terrible politics. And I was very heartbroken, and I said maybe I should shelve this book. And Gaitura Bahadur, the writer of Coolie Woman, I was talking to her, and I was so upset, and I said, Gaitura, I don't know what to do. And Gaitura said, you know what, Suchitra, I met these two people and I think they might be a good fit for you. And she introduced me to these two other agents, and one of them then became my agent, who was again not only my agent, but a wonderful editor who helped me think about this book, put it together. And she's the reason why I have the book is now in the India market. Now the book is going to be published in the US and UK.
Hmm.
So in that moment when I called Gaitura and I said, you know, I think this is done. I don't think I can do this anymore. I'm out of money. Everybody's rejected me. I can't do this anymore. I just given birth. I was, how am I, what am I going to do? And that moment, someone saved me, right? They said, you know, fine, let me. And it worked out for better. I had those people in my life. So now I try, but I will never say no to someone because it was so difficult for me to get it. But I also understand when someone doesn't want to, because when you've struggled so hard to even get a small piece of place for you, you just want to enjoy it, right? You don't immediately want to open it up because they've made it so difficult for you to get there. On the other hand, I have heard stories from friends who are writers in India who've told me how a certain very famous writer didn't get something. He literally went and complained to one of his friends, and she called somebody else and connected. And all of a sudden, this person had an agent, a deal, everything happened within a period of few weeks. I was absolutely
That's,
taken aback
hmm.
that this happened. Then why would you not be upset and angry at these people? Isn't that sentiment that every Indian feels?
Hmm.
If every single thing you want in life is a struggle, and you can only get there by throwing someone under the bus, it's like Hunger Games, right? So,
Hmm.
shouldn't we change that? So anything we and I'm talking about these small things. They might sound very petty, but it's not very petty. The exact same thing that happens for all of us. Again, I understand that book publishing is also very elite, so I also don't want to. I'm not just talking about the book publishing. Even getting your child into a good English medium school that most Indian middle class parents think is the way for them to become something else. How impossible is it? Very right. So once you then acquire that little bit of that class and stuff, you don't want anyone else to get it because you work so hard for it. And that's what we've done the entire nation. And this is how everything from getting access to ration cards, to getting citizenship, to getting your death certificates, to finally getting a job. everything, and that affects our nation as a whole as well. And I think it's very important for us to openly, candidly talk about this. I don't think enough people talk about it.
Hmm. Suchitra, moving forward, and I think, tell me, how was Nagaland? I think this one particular, you know, state. I think the mainland need to really, really relook at the whole Naga movement and the entire Nagaland. And it's so much of tall claims that we are one integrated nation, but you go to this state, and I think you have mentioned this in the book as well, that uh, that Indian army, that people have named their dogs after Indian army
Oh
soldiers.
my God, that was such. It's. I mean, people that that was actually something that we didn't know if you should put it on the thing or not. Simply because
Hmm.
somebody was like, "Oh my God, what if people got offended and they filed a case against you?" I'm like, "It's not filing a case against me. That's how people think." It
Hmm.
was very. I mean, we cannot forget the immense violence that we've, in the name of the Indian Republic, we have unleashed on these spaces. And I also didn't want to make this into another story of violence. And yet, that was everywhere. And that's why the book actually starts with the World War, right? The site of the World War and how this has been playing out for a few years. But that moment of finding myself on the other side, and then I, uh,
Do you want to
it's
take a break?
difficult. No, 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 it's fine. It's just I'm just it's that act of violence, the story I heard, and then being there and fearing. The moment I heard, I saw someone just touch my bag, and I'm already afraid that this might happen to me. This is what people live with, right? So, and I think there's this. The book ends with this stunning, brilliant Manipuri writer, Robin's book, a poem, "The Native Land." And he says, "First came the scream of dying in a bad dream." Um, and that whole poem, I think, more than me talking about it, I think I actually would love more people to read that poem. I think that's important, and I think the poem says, I'm saying from memory, so apologize if I got it wrong. The poem ends by saying, there are limits, but when the days absolved the butcher, I continue to live as if nothing happened. So that's the thing, that our history has absolved the butcher, and the butchers here are not just the British imperial colonialists, but the butchers are also us, the Indian state, people who the Indian state claims to represent, men sent to these places to represent. Uh, so yeah, so the butchers have been the butchers have been absolved, and it's a it's a story of immense violence, and it's a story of immense loss, but also how people continue, right? People continue to keep fighting. Mr. N didn't have to come with me, and yet he comes, he talks, he's the most optimistic and the most cynical person I know. He's a few years younger than my grandfather, but my grandfather passed away. And when I met him, it actually felt like, I wish I had done this with my grandfather. He passed away in 2004. I was too young to realize, have these conversations with him. But the conversations with Mr. N in the Kohima cemetery, he talks about how his memory is fading, but he remembers the thud the body makes when it hits the ground. When I heard that, I had this sense of the hair, the hair stands on the back of your neck. Till that moment, I've always heard people say, the hair stands on the back of your neck. That was the first time in my life I experienced it when he was speaking. Just that moment when he says that. But the Kohima cemetery is also a very interesting space because the epitaphs are so fascinating, right? Um, you have Darbar Khan born in Peshawar. You have Henry de Sosa from Paramanur. You have Sepoy Elysia from Malabar. You have another person who is Scottish but born in India and called. Um, it's just such the men who died for the empire, right? In that moment, it was that symmetry itself, this physical graveyards that tell us about a history that we've forgotten. They were, there's this one name in that, which didn't make it to the book. It was called Ranganayagan Pillai, and it said, um, um, it had, I forget the district's name. It's some Pillai district's name. And I was telling my dad about this, and my father was like, maybe this person was related to us from this region in Tamil Nadu where Pillais used to live. Um, in the back of my head, I still have his name, and I actually want to go figure out who this person is. Uh, but that is a story. That's a story, right? It's a story of men sent to war. But what happened to that war? That empire doesn't. Men sent to defend an empire that doesn't exist anymore. So tomorrow, now we are sending men to fight for a border that will not exist tomorrow. And I can write it to you. I can write it on paper and say this line will not exist tomorrow because that's the nature of human civilization. And yet we are here. And uh, I don't know. I mean, it's just there's so much for us to undo. And as a nation, if we want to keep saying this, and as a nation, we have to move forward. There's so much we have to undo.
And there's this point where I think you mention, I think this is a plaque on the monument quotes, Nagas are not Indians, their territory is not part of the Indian Union. We shall
Mm-hmm.
uphold and defend this unique truth at all cost and
Yes,
always.
it's there.
Yeah.
Anyone can go see that. Yeah, it's there. It's there.
Yeah, it's present, it's written in bold letters. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's there. You can go. I mean, all of this is there, right?
Yeah.
Another one says, died in a freedom struggle of the Naga independence, murdered by the Indian, you know,
Mm-hmm.
murdered by
Correct.
Indian on. Uh, and then there's in the Kaimangan region, there's actually I mean, there's another photograph that didn't make it because I didn't want to. Uh, yeah, I mean, the photograph didn't make it because I didn't want to. It's very easily identifiable, and I didn't want to. It actually says, "India killed my son." Can there be
Mm.
any more damning indictment of what we've done in the name of protecting our borders than a mother putting up a plaque of a dead son and saying that India killed my son? It's a very shameful moment. So for her, I am Indian, right? I'm
Mm.
Indian.
Correct. You
I'm
represent
Indian.
the Indian state in a way.
So I killed her son.
Mm. Wow.
So I mean, the point is that, I mean, none of this is. These are stories. These are the real stories that we need to clear, and we need to hold people accountable for this.
Would you like to throw some light on the Battle of Kohima? And I'm asking you because one thing which you have done very brilliantly is that every chapter you have given a very good historical context as well. So not
Hmm.
just this book serves as as you know a journal of stories, but it also educates one about the history of that region as well.
Right. So in Kohima, you have the war cemetery that is where the war cemetery is in Garrison Hill, where you had the battle, and this is one of the important battles of the Second World War. And this was a place where due to its strategic location, controlling Kohima was absolutely important for the Allied troops. So the Allied troops, if you look at the historical reading and the work, saw Kohima as the way to enter India and conquer India. Right? I mean, when I say conquer India, this is British India. So Kohima was a very crucial part, and the Allied troops had already made their way into the region. And they also needed to get Kohima to hold on to vital supplies for the Battle of Impal. All of these wars were happening in this. So you have to understand that World War II was not just fought in the trenches of Europe; it was fought all over the place. So the Kohima symmetry now uh, is the battle that decided the future of the empire and the future of what would happen. And Kohima was going to be the foothold for the Japanese to be able to enter India, but also occupy British India in order for them to do it, because the Allied forces had a very specific plan in mind in terms of what they had. So today, the cemetery has about, I think, 1,420 epitaphs of all the soldiers who perished in the Battle of Kohima. And this happened in 1944. And the epitaphs are again from all kinds of names. I have a notebook in which I very quickly wrote down all the names that I could, but only some of the names happened because the names themselves ran like for 4 pages or something. So my editor was like, no, let's just pick a few and put it in. So if you look at the epitaphs, they are men from across the world who came to fight. It was not just these troops. You had Scots, you had Englishmen, you had Khans, Pillais, Singhs, you had Nagas, you had Indians, you had Americans, Canadians, Australian armies, Nepalis, African soldiers. All of them fought against the Japanese and the Allied forces. And this is in some ways a forgotten imperial war. And it's an interesting moment in history because it shows us that this region was not just one. This region is also where you had the US brought in its forces. This was also the place where the African American Engineering Corps built the Lido Road, which was an essential part of it. So this region is, as much of a cliche, is pregnant with history. So much history that it still affects us today.
And this is now moving to the, a very very critical point in the book is Nelly,
Hmm.
you know and I mean, this was the point where I also messaged you on Twitter. I mean, it was very difficult for me to read after a few pages. And Yeah, for context, who are listening, more than 3,000 Muslims, mostly women and children, were massacred there in the surrounding villages on a single day in February 1983. Mm. And what what made you go to this place? Was it surrounding any particular border, or what? Why did you choose this place? And tell me about, from the point that you entered those villages, who till the time you left. It was
Yeah.
quite heartbreaking.
Um, so, just in terms of introduction to this, when I did the first India Bangladesh border, I actually didn't do Assam. I did some of it, but I didn't do all of it. So, when I returned to Assam, it was just before the NRC CAA process started happening. And it still wasn't in the news, but it had just started. And a few years earlier, I was speaking to someone who was one of the few people who had actually read the report. So after the massacre happened, there was actually a report that was published that talked about. Again, this report has been only read by a few people. It has never been made public, uh, and that I think that was always in the back of my head. And I was wondering, why is it that this massacre was never quite um, it was so this was not so this is one of the few places where this is not actually in the border, but the border politics very much defined what happened to these places. the rhetoric of the figure of the Bangladeshi, the figure of um, the figure of the
Insider, outsider.
insider outsider, the figure of the illegal. Um, and I think for me, it was very important to understand what this meant. And I didn't want this to be just the recounting of the massacre, but I really want this to be trying to make sense of the repercussions of what happened. And you can see the repercussions going on. I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go. But once I got there, I also went there after I had interviewed others who were now being caught with the doubtful voters. And um, so, in that sense, I think it was. I went. This was the last thing that I did. It doesn't end. The two things that I did last was I did this. This was my last uh, conversation on the actual the subcontinent, and the penultimate conversation was a conversation I have with Natasha. And I think this book, this chapter also, you can actually feel my exhaustion. I felt exhausted writing this. Not exhausted as in, oh my God, I have to. No, not that. I think I had come to that moment where I had just heard so much pain that I thought I was not going to do any justice. So I think, I don't know if you can see that in the chapter, but the chapter has
I can. Yeah.
the chapter has my exhaustion. It feels my the moment that I came close to absolute helplessness and hopelessness was this. And I also went and met Mr. Bhavan Singh, and I'm happy I spoke to Bhavan Singh, who was the photographer who photographed all of the
Only photographer.
yeah, the only photographer.
Lone photographer.
But there's also one more person I wasn't able to identify. With help of Ritesh, my friend, I was able to locate Mr. Bhavan Singh, but I couldn't locate the other photographer. He mentions there was one other photographer there, but who leaves very quickly. I don't know who that is, and I still haven't been able to locate this gentleman. Sadly, Mr. Bhavan Singh died I think he died this year. I only found out about it again much later. And I was so happy to have spoken to him and interviewed him. And
Hmm.
the thing he says, there's this one line where he says, he was there, and then Prime Minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, arrives to see, and she's very shocked to see him there as a photographer. And the Prime Minister doesn't spend more than 5 minutes in this place, and she quickly comes, sees, and then gets on a helicopter and then goes away. And
She also says something which is very ridiculous to me. I don't get it. I mean, she says, and when asked why she had not acted promptly to stop the violence during the Nelly massacre in '83, she replied, "One has to let such events take their own course before stepping in."
yeah,
Uh,
which I also
I don't know
found.
what she means.
I don't know, but I also
Yeah.
found this later as I was researching through a bunch of things. So I also, this is, but I think the thing that really, is when Bhavan Singh says, I saw the most powerful people in this country who could have done the right thing, do nothing.
Hmm,
Right?
correct.
He says that, Uh, and then he says, they treated the people who lost everything with so much disregard. And I think he could say that because he's a grand. When I met him, he was a grand old man. He was really, it was in his house in Delhi, in his archive room. And he says, how they were annoyed that the dead bodies were laid out and photographed. And he says, they had no empathy. And I think he was so. And also, I got to see Mr. Bhavan Singh's archive. I don't think I've never seen that India is gone. And I hope his archive actually gets published, or somebody does something with that archive. He could never find a right publisher. At least the last I spoke to him is his son Virender is still in Delhi. And I think just I'm glad I did. Again, we lost him to, I think, I don't know if we lost him to COVID, but I think he passed away this year. And there was no announcement. I couldn't even find. I only found out when Ritesh told me that he had passed away. He had heard from Virender. Uh, it's so sad, isn't it? We are losing all of these people so quickly. And also interesting is that nobody had actually spoken to Mr. Bhavan Singh about the massacre. I would have expected
It,
people.
yeah, correct.
Uh, and I when I told him, um, again, and when I quickly said, that the absolute generosity of everybody that I this who is in this book. Ritesh called Virender Singh, and Virender is also a brilliant photographer. And he said, "Come home." Everybody does that. Even everybody come home, and I've the amount of meals I've shared with people. Come home, and I sat, and then they spoke to me. He was in his 70s when I in his late 70s when I spoke to him. Of course, he also won the world press for the photographing the massacre. And I also told him when I told him that the people, that his photographs were such an important part of their loss. This
Absolutely,
and this
absolutely.
incredibly well traveled Dion, no, 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 there's this an important figure in Indian photographic history. Just completely just went quiet. He didn't have anything to say. He didn't know how to react because nobody had told him that. He never went back. And nobody had interview. I wish I had, now that he's gone, now I'm like, I wish I had gone back and done another interview with him because, again, not everything he said went into the book. Some of them things have gone in. And then he says, there's this moment he says, he says, I look at my images and sometimes I have this immense love for the people of this country. And then I see something that makes me very angry. And he says, I'm also very afraid, and I'm very afraid of our future. I'm afraid what will happen to our future. And if I remember correctly, he also says, I don't know where all this hate comes from, and I don't know where it's going to take us.
Hmm. Correct.
But imagine as people how much we have all witnessed and borne witness to. And I say this, this subcontinent has some of the most bravest and courageous people, but no nation should demand such courage from its people. No nation. But how much we demand of our people. And yet we are. And I see this. I see Kriba Munusamy, who's a lawyer that I don't know her personally, but every single day I see her and she's advocating for her people. And she's not the only one. There are many other very remarkable people of the subcontinent. The sheer courage it takes to just get up every morning and live and advocate for your people. We should be so proud of them. So proud of them. But yet it's unfair that we demand so much from them, right?
And you know, and the incident doesn't even makes it to. It's such a big, shameful incident. It doesn't even makes it to the mainstream imagination at all.
I actually thought that this is the case because I was born and raised in the South. I
Hmm.
thought that maybe the reason I didn't know all of this was because, yeah, that because I didn't know this. Often, once someone told me that very derogatorily told me when I was pitching uh, this book. This was actually an Indian publisher. I mean, not Indian publisher. This is an editor who used to be an Indian publishing house. He said, "Huh, Suchitra, everybody knows all of this. You don't know this because you're from the South." And I don't think anybody. Maybe you can write this for the people in the South, but I don't think in the North everybody knows all of this. He actually said this to me. Uh, so actually,
I don't think so. Hmm.
so yeah, so that was also the initial thing that yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. I want to move to Kashmir, and I think we'll conclude there. But before that, I think you have a very, very good chapter on Guwahati, and I think the way you have defined the Rohingya crisis and the Burmese policies that led to those crises, I think that is very, very important. Do you want to talk about that?
What about that? It's because there's a bunch of things that happen in the chapters. Anything specific?
No, I think yes. I think I would specifically would like you to talk, and this is where I drew parallel to CANRC, is the Burmese Citizenship Act of '82, which led the foundation of the Rohingya crisis of the Rohingya community, and their disenfranchisement and the situation with the Rohingya community right now and how they're perceived across the world, at least in countries with far right governments.
Sure. So I think for me, the all of this comes from Amir Hakim, who is this young Rohingya refugee who flees, but is wrongly detained in Guwahati for over a decade. After the book went to print, he was released and he's gone back, but the book had already gone to print. So in the second edition, we would update that. So Amir Hakim is out. He finally got out, um, which is a good thing.
Wow.
But he was arrested when he was barely a teenager, and he spent all of his 20s incarcerated for no. And also he served a sentence, and he continued to be incarcerated because nobody knew where to send him. And the Rohingya crisis is like a roadmap that Indian state is also borrowing from to disenfranchise people.
Correct.
And the
Correct.
similarities are,
Is
yeah,
uncanny. It's unbelievable.
yeah. So Rohingyas are a community, a Muslim community of the Arakan region. They live in the Myanmar borderlands. They have a long history, and also we forget that this region is a region that was used for travel, commerce, many people, because the Indian Ocean is also the ocean that is a center of civilization. It brought many people across. Um, so many of the book that I think most people refer to is Francis Buchanan's book on the comparative vocabulary of some of the languages spoken in the Burmese Empire. I think it's from in 1799, if I'm not mistaken. And what you really get is that this ancestry actually goes back to the Arab migration to the region, that has been dated about 18th century. Of course, people disagree on this moment, but at least archaeologists have dated 18th century. But today, this community is rebranded. I would say rebranded as illegal Muslim Bengali migrants. And what you've really seen is a genocide that has played out. But what is really important for us is to understand how did citizens of a region become subjects and then illegals. So this starts in the early 70s under the military dictatorship. And what you really see is the first wave of refugees arrived to India in 1978. And the reason they start arriving is because of the ongoing violence that happens in the townships, but also because in 1982 the Burmese Citizenship Act is brought into place. Another similarity, which is not in the book, but I would really understand or try to understand, is look at the Burmese Citizenship Act, but also a Citizenship Act that is put in Sri Lanka, which starts the war for Tamil Elam. It also starts the citizenship laws. Um, and there is some incredible work I'm waiting to come out of the Tamil migration into Sri Lanka and how citizenship is created there. Um, uh, but I mean, I'm meandering. But the thing is that what the Burmese Citizenship Act does is that it kind of puts into position laws that will create a class of stateless citizens, just as the CANRC does. First, what they did was they excluded the Rohingyas from the legally recognized ethnic group. So, in the Burmese constitution, initially had it creates a list of recognized ethnic groups that have lived in Myanmar prior to the British colonization in 1823. So first, the act of even creating that is crazy, because before 1823, how do we go back and say legally recognized, right? And the new law only granted citizenship for anyone who could prove. Imagine this: in 1982, you are demanding that people have to prove that their families lived in Myanmar before 1823.
Yeah, yeah,
In 1982, you have to prove with documentation that your family has lived in Myanmar from 1823.
correct.
I don't even know where my birth certificate is, honestly. Like, I think my mom has a copy. And I think I have a copy because, uh, yeah, I really, and my dad doesn't have a birth certificate. And my dad was born in the 1950s. Imagine if tomorrow someone asks my dad for a birth certificate, my dad cannot produce it. Imagine if they asked to produce my great grandfather's birth certificate from 1823. I mean, also understand that my father belongs to a community of landowning landlords. Pillais of Tamil Nadu were a privileged community, and they were also an educated community. Chances are, if any community had those documentations, it would be the landowners, right? Because as a landowner, you would have even a privileged community like the Pillais of Tamil Nadu. My father doesn't have documentation. Now imagine demanding. I mean, I don't know, does your family have documentation from 1823 to prove? I don't think so, right? Because that's
No.
what the law demands.
Mm.
Uh, it's impossible to do that. And prior to this 82 citizenship law, another thing that happens is that uh, uh, you know, Rohingyas had citizenship. So prior to 1982, Rohingyas had access to citizenship, um, but this again was racialized. They created a series of laws that would make citizens. So they started issuing different identity cards. So full citizens were given a pink card with blue identifying, green indicated you were not. So they had different ID cards that would identify different people. But Rohingyas were not issued any identity cards, right? They were given something called the temporary registration card, which is a white card. But even that card became a bureaucratic nightmare, because every year they would send people to clarify if you belonged to that. Next, what they did was there was a tax. Every time to exist, you need to pay a tax. You need to pay a tax for purchasing and selling rice. You had to pay a tax to get married. You had to have a pay a roof tax if you had a roof over the head.
Yeah, Rupert. Mm.
And majority of the people in this region were in detention because they couldn't pay a $45 fee required to get a marriage certificate or registration certificate. Imagine. That's why people were picked up. They stopped investing in schools. They stopped investing in public infrastructure. The doctor to the Rohingya community ratio was made. So they literally transformed this community into a stateless community.
With a very clear agenda. I mean, it's actually. I mean, what do I even say? This is like such a strong fascist agenda that the state of Burma followed.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's absolutely crazy. And what we are seeing today is a crisis that has manifested over 40
Mm-hmm.
years. Uh, yeah, yeah. Please go on.
No, I mean that's mostly what happened, and I think now that's exactly what we are doing, and that's why Hamir actually leaves. He runs away. Again, I never spoke to him. Everything I have of him is because somebody smuggled things out.
Hmm.
Now that he's out, I finally Imrul finally got his number, and I've been trying to talk to him, but the numbers are bad, and you can't reach him. And I've never. Uh, that's still a follow up that one has to do. Now that he's out.
And people talk about, there was a lot of talk in India as well that, oh, people are persecuted in these countries. They really need, people need to, at least hear one story of what it is like to be persecuted, to run for your life, to run away from your family, from your home, hoping that some land would accept you on humanitarian grounds. And this photo of the letter that you have of him, where he has handwritten it and he has addressed it to the UN and asking and demanding that, just help me.
Hmm.
It's so heartbreaking.
And it was smuggled out by.
It was smuggled out from a detention center.
Mm.
And what kind of country, what kind of nation do we want to be? I mean, and I am saying it on the podcast. We want to be a better nation. We want to be a much better nation than what we are becoming right now. And we want to go down this road. I mean, I get worked up a little bit when this issue of citizenship comes, because this podcast is an outcome of the citizenship movement.
Hmm.
And we were, and I'm sure you were as well, we were shouting on the top of our voice that don't go down this path, this is dangerous. And when I read this chapter about the Burmese Citizenship Act, I mean people were comparing it with Nuremberg laws, etc., but forget about it. I mean, something happened in your neighborhood
Hmm.
a few decades
Yeah.
ago. Yeah. And
You know,
it's
I was in India during the CA NRC protests, and I've never felt, I've never felt more proud. I've never felt, I mean, I try not to be nationalistic. Simply, as I said, I believe in a much larger sense of what it means. But if there is a moment when I felt this is it, this was a moment I'm feeling so proud to be an Indian, it was that moment standing in Chennai and seeing all those kids who shout Azadi and to fight. And of course, they made it difficult for us to protest in Chennai too. Let's also not forget that Tamil Nadu is not the bastion of civil liberties as everybody claims. We are slightly better, but not so much. And then I went to Delhi. I was at the Shaheen Bagh. I was at a conference for Delhi, so I went to Shaheen Bagh. I was also there the night that the JNU was attacked. I went there with a few friends because we got messages. So I saw what JNU attack was happening. And from there, I went to Calcutta to speak at another college. I was at the protest site in Calcutta. That is a republic I want to be a part of. That had these women, young people,
correct.
so proud of every single one of them. Immense
Mm,
pride. I want to be a citizen of that republic.
absolutely.
I don't know if that republic exists anymore, but I want to be a part of that republic. I want to identify with that community. I mean, my eyes are tearing up, but the women of Shaheen Bagh, man, what have they given us?
Hmm.
And now it's the anniversary, the 23rd. We saw that violence happen, but a year ago, when I was at the Calcutta Law School, when I spoke, somebody said, "Oh, what should we die for?" And I said, "You know what? Don't die for anyone. Why should you die for anyone?" But these are people I think it's worth dying for because it's remarkable. And let me say this: without Shaheen Bagh, there wouldn't be a farmers' protest today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
So yeah.
And I think, Suchitra, I think uh, this is a very good note, I think, to end this podcast.
Wonderful.
In this episode.
Let's end this now. And
Yeah,
thank you for
yeah.
having me. I know we didn't do Kashmir, but I'm sure there'll be other occasions.
Yeah, that's completely fine. I think we managed to cover the essence of your book when that was very important. And yes, thank you so much for spending such a long time on a Saturday morning with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I say this all the time. Someone's time is a political act. A conversation is a political act. And hopefully you will continue to do more of this. And thank you so much for everything you do and everything I hope you'll continue to do. It's an immense pleasure
Thank
to
you.
be a part of this podcast. Thank you.